Most important thing, obviously, that we've witnessed this morning are these sort of split screen, if you will, of these opening statements. We first heard from Jerry Blackwell with the prosecution, and it did not take long before we saw that image, not only seen here in this country, but around the world, of Officer Chauvin with his knee to George Floyd's neck. He talked about the application, the use of force. He talked about how the jurors would witness not only the image you see on your screen, but that video. And in fact, he played the video. He talked often about 9 minutes, 29 seconds, and played in his opening statement 8 minutes, 38 seconds of that video. And it was no easier to watch than it was when we were reporting on it some 10 months ago. He said jurors over the course of this trial will notice that from George Floyd, his words grew further apart. His breathing grew shallower. He said, "I can't breathe." And as Jerry Blackwell said on the prosecution, he said it 27 times. You could see Derek Chauvin taking notes a number of times during this opening statement. He said you're going to hear from bystanders, and he talked about use of force extensively. He said it should be consistent with training, that maybe what's reasonable in the first moment won't be reasonable in the next moment. He said you will hear about training involving CPR, that Derek Chauvin knew and was repeatedly trained on CPR, and will ultimately ask, did he sense that when we no longer heard anything from George Floyd, if that would be something that he should do. He said this is not about all police or about policing. This is from Jerry Blackwell, the prosecutor in this case. He said police officers have awful jobs, that they have to make split-second decisions. But then he went on to say this was not a split-second decision. They played, again, 8 minutes, 38 seconds. You could hear the bystanders asking that George Floyd's pulse be taken repeatedly, and you could see Derek Chauvin with a knee to the neck the entire time. He went into the medical part of this case that's expected to be a crucial part of the defense, knocking down what was expected to, that they would hear from the defense, and we did hear that a short time later from the defense team. Eric Nelson, when asked, do you want to present your opening statement? Presumably they could have taken a break then. He said yes, suggesting that he wanted to get right to it to counter what we had heard from the prosecution. He started out by talking about reasonable doubt, common sense. He talked about the number of FBI agents brought in to continue the investigation in this case. He said that what happened at that intersection, once the facts are laid out, that you were to use common sense in deciding what was the cause of death. He talked about the officer size, Derek Chauvin comparing him to George Floyd. He talked about authorized use of force and rapidly escalating and evolving situations. And he said use of force is not attractive, but necessary, according to Eric Nelson, the defense attorney for George Floyd. I want to bring in Lindsay Davis again, who's going to be watching this trial right here with me every step of the way. And first, I want to start by going back to the prosecution, because we know Jerry Blackwell was up first. And you and I both looked at each other. Often what we try to do in covering these trials is read facial expressions. That's going to be one more test of this trial, because as Derek Chauvin was taking notes, and while he was watching that video, the 8 minutes or so that was played already in the opening statement, you couldn't read his face.
I leaned in that moment to try to see what we could tell, even emoting from his eyes, because he was watching that video as it played. But yeah, as far as any kind of emotion, it was masked, literally and physically, figuratively. But he was taking lots of notes. He was very observant, very alert in that courtroom. And also one thing that I thought was so interesting is the prosecutor kept kind of like a rhyme scheme, as if he was really trying to get it implanted in the mind of those jurors. He kept talking about he didn't let up and he didn't get up. He said that multiple times, maybe as many as a dozen times there. And he made this about the 9 minutes and 29 seconds. As you said, he really tried to emphasize that this was not a split-second decision, that it was 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And then in contrast, you had the defense attorney who said the evidence is far greater than 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And he's really trying to make it about what happened before and leading up and what you didn't see before the camera started rolling. And I thought that what was interesting is that one attorney said that the uphill battle is really for the defense, because you're telling the jurors they can't believe their eyes. And this was something that we heard directly from the prosecutor. You can believe their eyes. One of the witnesses going into today said he had never seen the video. He saw it today. I'm sure he's going to see it multiple times. And something, as you say, watching it again still makes you feel.
Yeah, I was thinking about the people at home having to watch this as well, and so often we, for the evening news or for the morning news, go out of our way to make sure some of the explicit nature of what you're witnessing doesn't land at home if there are other people in the room. But given that this is a trial and our warning is up the entire time, it is visceral, it is difficult, and just as difficult, if not more, 10 months later. Lindsay, I also wanted to ask you about something we heard from both Jerry Blackwell, the prosecutor, and from Eric Nelson, the defense. This was one of the few areas where they kind of crossed over and had somewhat of an agreement. You heard from Jerry Blackwell, not about all police officers or about policing. You heard from Eric Nelson, this is not political or a social cause. Both sides are trying to get the jurors to look at the facts of this specific case. And as you point out, it's going to be very difficult for the defense, no matter what the facts are on the defense side, to go up against that piece of video.
They're really trying to suggest this is not an overarching, sweeping statement, that this is not about race or any social issues. This is about what happened in this one particular case. I thought it was very interesting in the questioning ahead of time to the jurors, where there was a lot of conversation about race, trying to make sure that that wasn't going to cause the jurors to be partial or biased leading into it. And they allowed a lot of nuance, a lot of introspection and thoughtful conversation from the jurors when they, ahead of time, one of the women who's black said, Black lives do matter because I'm black and my life matters. And at that point, the defense attorney said, yes, it does. You're right. And so I think that it's going to be an interesting distinction and a line that they have to walk in order to try to make this specifically about Derek Chauvin and George Floyd.
And they can make the case that it's not about something bigger, but we know for our viewers, not only in this country, but around the world, this is a conversation that is bigger than this case. Certainly this case, a significant part of that conversation. I want to bring in Dan Abrams, our chief legal analyst. And Dan, you know, much of what you had predicted about what we would hear from both the prosecution and from the defense is what we saw.
Yeah, a couple of little interesting notes, additional color coming from both sides. First of all, from the prosecution. I was interested, and we knew that they were going to be calling police witnesses, but how much he focused on the fact that you'll see the police chief, you'll see other officers, you'll see former officers coming in to say, no, this isn't what police officers are supposed to do. No, this isn't what their training teaches them to do. I think those are going to be very powerful witnesses for the prosecution. Because, look, I guess I'm surprised that the defense attorney, Eric Nelson, didn't say something along the lines of, that tape is hard to watch. Because I think anyone watching that, as Lindsay said, has an emotional response to that. I don't care if you think it was his training or not his training. The bottom line is I expected some more from Eric Nelson saying this is going to be difficult. It's a tough tape to watch. And leaving at least open the possibility that maybe Derek Chauvin didn't do everything according to the book, but that it shouldn't be criminal, but that there was a separate cause of death. But instead, he went all in on the defense, saying he abided by his training. He said he did exactly what he was trained to do. And so that's where I was a little surprised at the tone of Eric Nelson coming out of that video, because regardless of what you think ultimately about the cause of death, you have to be able to at least agree that watching that tape is really, really hard to do.
Dan, I think that's interesting, the lack of acknowledgement of what the jurors had just witnessed. And you juxtapose that with the fact that it did not take long for Eric Nelson to bring up the counterfeit $20 bill up against that 8 minutes of video the jurors had just watched.
Yeah, and look, I understand why he needs to present context, right? He wants to present this as an event, right? Not just those moments on the ground. I get that. That's part of the defense here. Part of the defense is about the drug use. Part of the defense is about how he responded even before this incident occurred. That shows you the mindset of Derek Chauvin and some of the other officers. I get that. But the video's the video. And you just, he sort of really kind of brushed it aside. The one argument he did make, which was substantive about the video, was this notion that because there were these bystanders there, in effect that the officers started getting afraid, they started getting distracted. But if the argument is that his knee was on his neck too long because he was distracted, again, that's a tough legal argument to make, that he wasn't able to do what he's supposed to do because there were people yelling at them, and as a result, he couldn't focus enough on George Floyd. That is kind of what the defense was saying.
Dan Abrams, our thanks to you. Terry Austin also watching this with us, host and legal analyst for Law and Crime. And Terry, it was interesting to watch the defense attorney, jump right in with his opening statement, so as if to not let any window of time allow that to settle in with the jurors who had just witnessed this horrific video. And for many of them, they had acknowledged in their questioning before they were selected as jurors that they had not seen the video at that length.
Right, David, you make a very good point there. Eric Nelson did not want that jury to sit and deliberate in their own minds by themselves about what the prosecution had just said. He wanted them to hear his side of the story. And I think Dan raised an excellent point. And it really struck me when Nelson said this. He said that the officers had to divert their attention to the crowd because they couldn't focus specifically on the care of George Floyd when that happened. That actually bothered me. I did not think that was a good defense, not a good enough excuse. What I think he did well, his opening was a little shorter. It was about 25 minutes. I think from a tactical standpoint, he wanted the jury to know, look, this isn't just about the 9 minutes and 29 seconds. He said there were 50,000 bait stamps, 400 witnesses. He wanted to make sure the jury knew that there's more to the story. And from a substance standpoint, obviously he talked about that Chauvin did what he was trained to do. You're going to see all of the policies as far as restraint is concerned. And he wanted to make sure that the cause of death, the jury knew there was a disagreement there. They believed that the cause of death was this, cardiac arrhythmia, and that he had this drug use, and that was why that Floyd died. So he said those two things, but overall, I've got to tell you, one of the things the jury looks at is who's telling me the truth. And I think Blackwell did a good job of admitting to some of the flaws in his case. So he talked about the drug use. And as Dan said, I don't think Eric Nelson did that as well. He should have talked about the video. He should have admitted some of the things that will be problematic in the case. And I think when you do that, the jury is going to listen a little bit better.
So both Terry Austin, Dan Abrams with us, making that similar observation that Eric Nelson didn't acknowledge for the jurors what it is they had just looked at and the horror in that 9-minute video. Terry, thank you. I do want to bring in Pierre Thomas, our Chief Justice Correspondent, because, Pierre, ultimately what this country is watching after 10 months of reporting on this is a case which did escalate and go in far different directions with such an awful outcome. But it did begin with a counterfeit bill and an initial call to police. And Eric Nelson actually began his argument by talking about that. It's just sort of extraordinary to this day to know that that's how this all began to unfold.
David, you're exactly right. Equal justice under the law. At the end of the day, once they debate the pros and cons of this case, the broader public, all of us who are watching this, will look at this question of equal justice under the law. And one of the issues is that you can say whatever you want. George Floyd is dead over $20. $20. And you heard the prosecutor lay out the fact that when the officers arrived, even though there was no allegation of violence, that they immediately pulled out their weapon, that there was a presumption that this would somehow become violent. That is an issue. And also, I think that many watching this trial, and particularly African Americans, will be looking at the issue of whether there is fairness in policing. I looked at some data. ABC News did an investigation with our own stations, and we looked looked at some 800 jurisdictions in terms of how police arrest people. And we found that in Minneapolis, for example, blacks are only 19% of the population, but they're arrested 62% of the time at a rate far higher than their white counterparts.
Pierre Thomas watching the trial with us here as well. I want to bring in TJ Holmes down at our Times Square studios from Good Morning America. And TJ, one of the things that the defense attorney tried to make, the point he tried to make was that Chauvin was dealing with a rapidly evolving situation, crowd control, de-escalation. But again, the biggest challenge for the defense here is that piece of video that America, the world saw. And you heard those bystanders even asking, check for a pulse, what are you doing? And to look at that video and try to make that case is going to be an uphill battle.
Yeah, but we have a lot of people, David, watching today, in the black community in particular, with a sense of trepidation. Because it seems almost in the conversations we've all had, it seems like over the past year, that this is going to be different. There's no way. There's video here. There's almost a 10-minute video. He's on the guy's neck. I mean, how could this be different, or how could charges not come, or how could a conviction not come? But then you think back to a 12-year-old boy in Cleveland named Tamir Rice, who was shot as soon as police got out of the car when he had just a toy gun at a playground. And those officers were never even indicted. You go to Eric Garner selling loose cigarettes, no charges for those officers. You go to Philando Castile, officer was acquitted. You go to Breonna Taylor, who was shot, and the only officer charged in that was the officer that missed her. If he had actually hit her and shot her, he wouldn't have been facing any charges. I bring all those up because the black community is watching with this sense of, oh, here we go again. That even though things stack up, you're looking at it with your own eyes, as the prosecutor said, like he died breath by breath, and you're watching that for almost 10 minutes. But still, you have to wait to see if justice this time is going to work out. And David, we heard it. We've heard that all before. What you talked about with Derek Chauvin there and talking about the environment. So oftentimes in these cases, what do you hear? You see something, the crime that took place, it's awful. And then what do we go back to? The story that the defense just told us. All right, he was in the store. He was drunk and out of his mind. They came out twice to ask him to come pay. He wouldn't. He got in the car. He took some pills. He's out of control. He went to sleep. They had to fight with him. Derek Chauvin's only 5'9", 140, and here's a big black guy, 6'3", 223. So we're watching as the community watches once again with this sense of trepidation that here we go again, that even with that kind of evidence, as you all are talking about, hard to overcome, there are plenty of people watching this in the black community going, I wouldn't be surprised if they did find a way to overcome it, Dave.
TJ Holmes making very important points here this morning, that there are going to be comparisons made to so many explanations given before about the actions of law enforcement, and enlisting a multitude of cases. And I want to bring in Terry Moran on this point, our senior national correspondent, because, Pierre, this was something that Lindsay and I chatted about not long ago. When you hear Jerry Blackwell and the prosecution saying that this is not about all police or about policing, you hear Eric Nelson for the defense saying this is not political or a social cause in the courtroom. And that might be true in the courtroom, but we know we have a much broader audience in this country, around the world, because it's being live streamed, who recognize that this is, whether you like it or not, part of something much larger.
It's part of American history. You're absolutely right, David. This is a global event, and the whole world is watching. But I would suggest also that inside that courtroom, inevitably, the jurors, by design, are there to be the voice of the community, not just as finders of fact and those who apply the law to the facts, but on the meaning of it. They aren't going to go rogue, but they're meant to express the sense of the community about this incident, not with a political speech, but with their verdict. They will understand that part of their role is to vindicate the facts of what happened and what they mean for the community. It is inevitable. Jurors understand themselves. Anybody who's ever served on a criminal jury knows it's one of the most intense experiences of your life. You have an enormous amount of power in your hand. The state is asking for the power to put someone behind bars, or perhaps even to death. That is a political act. It's an act of power. And jurors understand that the exercise of the power through their verdict matters to the wider community, and I think that is inevitable in the courtroom.
Certainly is inevitable, Terry. Thank you. Rachel Scott, who has been covering this for the last 10 months with us as well, both there at the White House and from Black Lives Matter Plaza, not far from the White House. Of course, this all playing out 10 months ago in the middle of a presidential campaign. It became part of not just this reckoning on race and justice in our country, but became a political discussion about which candidate, President Trump or President Biden, are most capable of handling this moving forward. And Rachel, now that Joe Biden is the president and in the White House had said that the president and several members of this administration obviously will be watching this trial very closely.
Very closely, David. We know that. And we also know that White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said President Joe Biden was personally affected by the death and the killing of George Floyd. She said that it redoubled his commitment to wanting to advance racial justice and racial equity in this country. They have called police reform an urgent issue. But I can also tell you, David, that I have spoken to many protesters who were outside of the White House for weeks, for days, for months, demanding for justice, demanding for change. And they are frustrated by the lack of action, not only by the president, but also by lawmakers. After the death of George Floyd, we did see bipartisan talks around police reform, but those fizzled when Democrats and Republicans could not get on the same page. President Joe Biden said he wants to establish a National Police Oversight Commission in his first 100 days in office. That has not happened yet. So you have the words Black Lives Matter painted on the street leading up to the White House. Activists say that's a powerful symbol, but they want policies that reflect the meaning of those words, David.
All right, Rachel Scott at the White House. Rachel, we appreciate it as always. Let's get back to Alex Perez on the scene there in Minneapolis. And Alex, you were telling us earlier about the significant security presence there and the fact that this trial is playing out on the 18th floor of that building there behind you. And the reason we're all able to watch it live streamed is that decision by the judge, because he said it simply wouldn't be fair given the fact that members of the community and members of both sides in the courtroom, because we're also watching this unfold as this pandemic continues.
Yeah, David, they're taking so many precautions to make sure this trial can move forward in a smooth fashion. You know, all of us have said watching that video play out in the courtroom was very difficult to see. And I think in many ways that was the point, to show just how difficult that moment, that event was. This is what makes this case different than so many others. We have all of that evidence, that video on cell phone that was played in the courtroom and seen around the world. We expect as this case now moves forward, the defense will continue to build their case to say that it was not Derek Chauvin's knee, but it was those previous medical conditions, his heart condition and drug use that led to his death. Also, David, we should point out it's not lost on people who are watching, particularly black people, that Jerry Blackwell was the person delivering that opening statement for the prosecution. That decision made just last week. It was supposed to be Matthew Frank, but it was Jerry Blackwell. He will continue with this case as it moves forward now, David.
Expected to last, thank you, Alex, 3 to 4 weeks. And Lindsay Davis will be right here with me. And Lindsay, your final thought here on these opening statements.
Sure. You know, I think that there's such an important distinction that you made as far as how this is playing out inside the courtroom versus globally. And there's been so much conversation about this racial reckoning. And reckoning, by definition, is a settlement of a bill or account. And the jury is still out on that as far as if that is in fact happening in this country. And a lot of people are going to be looking to this trial to see, are we taking some steps toward equality in the criminal justice system? And lastly, I just want to say there was a minister in Minneapolis who said that there are a lot of black people in that community who don't have faith that there is going to be a guilty verdict here. And he said, because we've seen this movie again and again and again, so much so that we can recite the lines.
All right, Lindsay Davis with us here as well. Our thanks to you, Lindsay, and to Dan and Terry and our entire team. Alex Perez there on the ground. Our coverage continues on ABC News Live, abcnews.com.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.